generation.
Dates in the Bible don't quite match the marriage certificate. Uh-oh.
And welcome, America, to America's family history show, Extreme Genes and ExtremeGenes.com. It is Fisher here, your radio root sleuth, on the program where we shake your family tree and watch the nuts fall out. Great guest today, a couple of ordinary people with extraordinary finds, and I think you're going to love these stories. First of all, we're going to talk to a man out of Chicago who has linked his ancestor to the execution of King Charles I. And in as much as we're talking so much about the royal family these days, you're going to want to hear this story and the hidden identity of his ancestor and how they're kind of figuring out who he really was. Great stuff coming up in about 10 minutes with Scott Norick. And then later in the show, Andrew Malikoff from Long Island talks about his dad fighting the Nazis back in the 1930s in the United States of America. We'll tell you all about that coming up as well. Hey, if you want more great stories and more great shows, past and present, then you got to sign up for our weekly Genie newsletter on our Facebook page or at ExtremeGenes.com, and you get a blog from me each week as well. Right now, off to Boston, David Allen Lambert is standing by, the chief genealogist of the New England Historic Genealogical Society and AmericanAncestors.org. Hello, David.
I have some fab news for you.
Really?
It's genealogical fab. In fact, if you remember the term fab, you would remember the Fab Four, and one of them, Ringo Starr. Of course, people know him as Richard Starkey.
Yeah.
You know, that's really not his family name. It turns out his grandfather on his dad's side was born John Parkin.
What?
And changed the name to John Starkey when his own mother had remarried. So you could have Ringo Parkin or Ringo Perkins.
Ringo Parr.
That's true.
That doesn't work.
True.
That's really interesting.
Yep, so the Fab Four could have had a different spin on it if Ringo's great-grandmother didn't remarry.
Interesting,
so many years ago. Well, I love when you can find a scratch ticket that wins. How about when you win $60,000 from a relative you never knew? Well, 119 people are related to Joseph Stanczak of Chicago. He had died back in 2016, and he left his $11 million estate amongst 119 distant relatives who never even really knew him.
Yeah, it actually had to be researched to find these people. They never knew the guy, never laid eyes on him in his life, and they're each going to get $60,000. I actually had this happen once in our family. Somebody related to my wife had a common ancestor born in the 1780s and had no descendants. And so as a result of that, our kids and some of my wife's cousins' kids wound up getting like $1,700 a piece. So it was kind of fun money, but it was amazing because we never knew this person either.
Well, you know, I love when old family letters reconnect distant relatives and cousins. But in this case, Antonia Reed, who grew up in Canada, actually had lost her mom when she was 20. Well, a relative in Sweden sent her a pile of letters. Now, you would think this is normally going to be an easy thing. You know, you can kind of pull a diary, a part of your mother's life. Yeah, well, actually, the letters are written completely in Swedish. So she's now had to embrace her heritage to know her mother's past and learn a little Swedish on the way.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? And this woman has been missing her mom a long time and kind of felt she wasn't very good at speaking Swedish when she was a kid. And her mom tried to encourage her at their home in Canada. And so some of her relatives, when she would visit Sweden, would kind of make fun of her. So she had to go back and go at it again. And 7 years later, she's still doing it and feeling very competent now in her Swedish and learning more about her mother's thoughts from these intimate letters. A huge pile of them, by the way.
Well, you just never know when you're going to dig up the past. Well, digging up the past in Sweden is my next story I want to share with our listeners, and this is because 2 Viking graves were found. Well, Viking graves are found all the time, but in this case, they found swords straight up. in the ground.
Wow.
So these are in there as a symbolic way of basically preventing the dead from rising. Has a hark back to horror movies with Dracula and wooden stakes through the heart. But this is straight from a cemetery 1,200 years ago, and these are two graves found in the same site, and they both had swords arranged the same way. So, interesting stuff. Well, digging into the past also brings into some gruesome history, and that, of course, is the Black Death. In fact, recently in London at East Smithfield plague pits in London, they found mass burials from 1348 to 49. Now, Fish, chances are, because so much of the population affected, most of our listeners will probably have an ancestor or some relative that died. 30 to 50% of the population from Europe, Middle East, North Africa was wiped out. But they're saying now that if your ancestors survived, well, obviously they have descendants, but you may be suffering from Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, or lupus because they survived the Black Death. That hyperimmune system that kept your ancestors from dying hundreds of years ago during the Black Death may be causing health problems today. And now they're saying that it may be something that in the future they'll have to look at for people that survived COVID.
Yeah, really true.
So,
and of course, we have all these variations of COVID. And of course, COVID has affected people from different ethnic backgrounds differently, too. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. But I doubt Dave will be around to find out the results of that study.
I'll leave some letters and send them to Sweden. That's what I have from Beantown this week. I'll catch you with Ask Us Anything in just a little bit, as always. And remember, if you've never been to Boston before, we welcome you to visit American Ancestors in person at 101 Newbury Street. You can use the $20 code EXTREME to save on your membership, and you can also benefit by going to our website, AmericanAncestors.org, and virtually do your research with us.
All right, David. Very good. We will talk to you in just a little bit. And coming up next, it's a man who discovered that his ancestor may not have been who his ancestor claimed to be. In fact, he may have been involved with the execution of a king. You're going to want to hear the story dug up by Scott Norick of Chicago. Coming up next when we return in 3 minutes on Extreme Genes, America's Family History Show.
Have you hit a brick wall in your family tree? Are you unsure how to use your DNA test results to resolve a research question? Do you want to travel where your ancestors walked and need to find details before you go? Need help joining a lineage society? Whatever your genealogy research question, the answer is Legacy Tree Genealogist. Legacy Tree Genealogist has been helping clients all over the globe discover their story since 2004. Legacy Tree has carefully selected and trained professionals who specialize in hundreds of countries and languages, as well as probate research and DNA analysis. And when you need experts on the ground in the countries where your ancestors came from, Legacy Tree Genealogists calls upon its global network of on-site researchers who know the local language and how to get their hands on the records you need. Request your free quote today at legacytree.com. That's legacytree.com.
Genies, our friends at BYU TV have a new series out created just for us, family historians. It's called How I Got Here. It's a fast-paced travel show where young adults accompany their immigrant parents back to where they came from, their countries of origin. These are 10-day trips of a lifetime where these parent-child duos relive the sacrifice, struggle, and circumstances that led their families to leave to where they are now. There's a new episode every week with visited countries including Italy, Serbia, Mexico, Chile, Israel, Slovakia, and Ghana. BYU TV is on Roku and Fire Stick, online at byutv.org, or through the BYU TV app. How I Got Here is available now with a new episode every week. Feel the impact this journey has on those who grew up not knowing. And just a warning, keep a box of Kleenex nearby. You're going to need it. Hey Genies, as we've dug into our family history explorations over the past year, our community at Genealogy and Family History Breakthrough Strategies has taken off. This is where you can meet like-minded genealogists who can help you break through those brick walls and find a whole city behind it, occupied by ancestors whose names you don't even know yet. This is where you can learn from your fellow Genies and ask questions, because many in our community have already been into some of the records you're looking for. Genealogy and Breakthrough Strategies is free. What a great place for brainstorming and getting to know other people who totally get your passion for family history research. If you're looking to take the next step in sharpening your skills, here's a great chance to learn from others and give back in areas you've already become expert in. So join us. That page again is Genealogy and Family History Breakthrough Strategies. It's a long name, but we cover a lot of territory. Genealogy and Family History Breakthrough Strategies. Hey, welcome back to the show. Extreme Genes, America's family history show on extremegenes.com. It is Fisher here, your radio root sleuth. And we've talked a lot this year about the royal family. Of course, we've lost Queen Elizabeth. Now we have King Charles III on the throne. And my next guest discovered he had a tie to King Charles, but it was King Charles I. And it led to an amazing story that only in recent years has been cracked. Scott Norick is on the line from Chicago with another ordinary person with an extraordinary find. Scott, welcome to Extreme Genes.
Hey, Scott. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
So how did you get started in this chase with royalty in your family?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting story. A number of years ago, I started tracing my family history and started with a grandmother of my father's. And I knew her name, but I really didn't know anything more than that and her background. And through following the paper trail, I was able to go back to colonial America and traced her back to a gentleman named Theophilus Whale that was living in colonial Rhode Island in the 1600s. He would have been my 8 times great-grandfather.
Okay.
And as I found him, I saw that there had been a lot that had already been researched and written about him. And it became a fascinating story, but it was a story that required me to dig in to learn a little bit more about English history, because it seemed that he may have been tied in some way to King Charles I and II.
Right. Well, and the first, of course, was executed. Then you had the Cromwellians come in, and then Charles II came back and took out revenge on all those people who had taken down his father all those years before. And the Whale family in New England is really kind of well known. I know that there was an Eleazar Whale who was one of the people who kept track of the finances of the Revolution in Connecticut. So I don't know if he was tied to this man, but it seems it was a prominent name at that time.
Yeah, well, Theophilus ended up having 5 children that lived into adulthood, and a lot of people descend from him, and he did have a lot of prominent descendants. So I don't know about that particular one, but it very well could be.
Sure. So let's talk about now this dual identity that you discovered through your research.
Yeah, well, it goes back to, as you mentioned, what happened with King Charles I and II. King Charles I was, by all accounts, not a great or popular king. The English economy was not good under his reign. Taxes were high, there were war, and the English Parliament had been trying to negotiate with the king for him to change his ways and to not be so tyrannical. And King Charles I believed in the divine right of kings, that he really only had to answer to God,
right,
and just wasn't open to listening to anyone else. So this story really goes back to the English Civil Wars. So all of that controversy between the king and Parliament led to civil wars in England in the 1640s. And on one side was the king and the royal family and their army. And on the other side was the English and Scottish Parliament. And they raised an army. And the kind of leader of that group was Oliver Cromwell.
Yep.
And Oliver had a first cousin named Edward Whaley. They were both members of Parliament. And for a number of years, there were battles in England that the Parliament's army ultimately won that war and captured the king. And once they captured him, they once again tried to negotiate with him. And if he was going to continue as the monarch, he needed to change his ways. He refused to do that. And Parliament ultimately put him on trial, found him guilty of treason and executed him in 1649.
Yeah.
And Oliver Cromwell and Edward Whaley were two of the big folks involved in that. And so you had mentioned, Cromwell then became the leader of a republic. So for a little over a decade, there was no monarch in England, and it was run as a republic with Oliver Cromwell at the head. But things really didn't get much better in England. Cromwell was also a controversial figure. And when he passed away in 1658, that sort of opened up a leadership vacuum in England. And King Charles had a son who had been in exile. And once Cromwell died, he rallied his support for those that were loyal to his father and the royal family. And he was able to reestablish the throne in 1660. And so England has had a continuous monarch since 1660. But once he got on the throne, one of his first orders of business was to get retribution from those that had executed his father. And at the time, they called them regicides, which is the term for someone that
kills the royal family. Yeah,
exactly right.
And think about it, too. I mean, they had the long arm of the law. They had the best navy. There wasn't really anywhere in the world that you could hide that somebody couldn't find you.
Well, that's right. And there were 59 members of parliament that signed the king's death warrant. Many of those were captured after King Charles II took the throne and were either executed or imprisoned for life. A number of them, though, were known to escape and go to different lands. And there were three that were known to have escaped to New England. And those three were Edward Whaley, William Gough, and John Dixwell. And, at first you wouldn't think escaping to New England was a safe place for them because at the time, New England was still a part of England, English colonies. The good news to them, there were a lot of prominent colonists that were sympathetic to what they had done. King Charles I was not a popular figure. Some of the colonists were not necessarily in favor of the monarchy. And so they found help in sort of hiding them out. Yeah. And they all changed their names, and they all had to be very careful and lived in mystery and obscurity. But all of them eventually lived the remainder of their days in New England.
Interesting. And then with the changed names, of course, that kind of causes problems for family history researchers.
It does, and there's still not ironclad proof on who is who today. That's what makes my research and some of this history so interesting. But the things that were known about Theophilus, his family knew that he did have a secret past that he would not talk about. He was known to have come from a prominent English family, and he was extremely well educated. He was proficient in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, yet lived a very modest life as a fisherman and a weaver in Rhode Island. And the one story that the people in the community and the family members knew about, it's one that led them to believe that he was one of the regicides, is that during the time he was in Rhode Island, there was a ship that anchored off of Rhode Island. The captain of that ship sought out Theophilus, and Theophilus met with him, and they embraced as two relatives that hadn't seen each other in a long time. The captain's last name was Whaley, and Theophilus did say it was one of his cousins that he hadn't seen in a long time. And the interesting part of that story is that the captain invited Theophilus to come back to the ship at dinner and join him for dinner on the ship. Theophilus originally agreed to that. The captain went back to the ship, and Theophilus was going to meet him later. But after thinking about it a little bit further, Theophilus thought it could be a trap,
of course,
to capture him and take him back to England for trial. So he sent his regards that he wasn't going to come for dinner on the ship. But there are several stories about Theophilus similar to that led people to believe that he was one of the regicides. Part of the story, though, is that after Theophilus died, and about 50 years after that, there was a scholar named Ezra Stiles who actually wrote a book about these regicides, and he did a lot of scholarly research on who their real identities were.
Now, he was at Yale, right?
Yeah, he eventually became the president of Yale, yes. And a lot of the regicides at one time or another actually were living in New Haven, Connecticut, and there are a number of streets in New Haven that have been named for the three regicides that lived there at one time. So he did a lot of research on it, and he researched Theophilus. And because some of the dates didn't line up real well, his conclusion that Theophilus really wasn't Edward Whaley, the regicide that was a member of parliament inside the king's death warrant, but he did strongly believe that Theophilus was Edward's younger brother, Robert Whaley. And Robert was also a first cousin to Oliver Cromwell. So he was tied into that family. But Robert was a military officer that was in the unit that captured the king and oversaw his execution.
Ooh.
And the commander of that unit was ultimately caught by King Charles II and executed. So Robert certainly had reasons to fear for his life.
Sure.
And be very guarded with who he really was. So again, we may never know the exact identity of him, but most of the evidence lines up that he was probably Robert Whaley and the first cousin to Oliver Cromwell.
Unbelievable story. So have you ever found out if any of the male line descendants have done, say, a Y-DNA test to try to tie into the Whale family?
I have not. I've thought about that, and that would be obviously one way to try to solve this mystery once and for all.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And when you think about how many of us tie into royalty, you know, that's one thing. It's always fascinating to learn about the kings and how far back you can go, and you can tie into Charlemagne and to William the Conqueror and all that. Boy, but when you get into specific incidents like this of history where, you know, you have an execution, you have a worldwide manhunt, you have the regicide, I mean, that's just unbelievable stuff.
It is, and it's what makes family history research so fascinating. And you know, you find a lot of really inspiring, great stories. You find some negative stories. Every person has both good and bad in their ancestral past. But you find a lot of interesting stories like this. And I never would have imagined tying into an event like this. And obviously now with King Charles III about ready to have his coronation and taking the throne, it reminded me of my links or potential links to King Charles I and II.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, that's strong work, first of all, Scott. So nicely done. And good luck with your research in the future. It sounds like you really have a handle on what you're doing. And I hope you write this up for your kids.
Yeah, well, I definitely will.
All right. Thanks so much for coming on. Scott Norick in Chicago, another ordinary person with an extraordinary find, and you can do the same.
Thank you, Scott.
And coming up next, another ordinary person with an extraordinary find, learning about your dad fighting Nazis in the 30s in the U.S. Hear all about it coming up next when we return in 5 minutes. We are back. It's America's Family History Show, Extreme Genes and ExtremeGenes.com. And as you know, I love to find ordinary people with extraordinary finds, find out how they did it, and get some of the details. And one of those people is my next guest, Andrew Malikoff. He is in Long Beach, Nassau County. He's on Long Island in New York. And Andrew, welcome to Extreme Genes. It's great to have you.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I've been cruising around the internet, and I ran into this great story about your discovery about your father and a little of his background you weren't familiar with. Let's talk about that. What got you going on this?
Well, my father, he's the oldest of 4 siblings, 2 younger brothers, and then below both of them, a sister. And they grew up in Newark, New Jersey. Their parents were immigrants from Russia around the turn of the 20th century. And my uncle was the last surviving brother. He just died 1 year ago, and my aunt is still alive. But when I used to spend time with him, I always loved it because he was the family historian, a great storyteller. And he would rapid fire tell stories. And there was one that he told me that kind of stuck in my head, and I needed to know more about it. And what it was he told me that my father, who was actually a great high school athlete, all the boys were, they grew up poor, but they had a great close family, and they were all very athletic, that when he was graduated from high school sometime in the late 1930s, that this was around the same time that Adolf Hitler had been about 6 years into his power. He came to power in 1933. Around that time, this group formed in the United States, which was first known as the Friends of New Germany, and then it became the German-American Bund.
Ooh.
They represented the center of Nazi activity, which was very active in the Newark, New Jersey area where they grew up, which is the biggest city in New Jersey.
Now, what did these guys do? What did they call them? The Bundists?
Yeah, they called them the Bundists. That was the later name was the German American Bund. They dressed like the brown shirts in Nazi Germany. And there was probably at their peak around 25,000 of them in this area.
Ooh. They
held rallies. There's a famous rally people could find if they did a search at Madison Square Garden. And in the Newark area, they had meetings and rallies in that area. And so the story my uncle told me was that my father was recruited by an infamous local gangster. He recruited some young guys, I suppose guys who were fit and tough, and he had them rounded up and taken over to where these Bund meetings would be held. And if there was any kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric, they would throw stink bombs, which is kind of like ammonia sulfide, into the window, and that would get everybody scattering out like cockroaches when you turn the lights on.
That's a good comparison.
Yeah, and as soon as they would go outside, they would just beat the heck out of them. So these were, young, tough Jewish guys who were taking on the Nazis here in the United States.
Wow. And so your uncle said your dad was a part of this whole thing, and you've been researching it ever since.
Yeah, that's right. He just mentioned it, as I said, it was almost in passing because he had so many stories. So I didn't know too much about it. So I had not too long ago read the novel that Philip Roth, who is a great Pulitzer Prize winning author, wrote, and it was called The Plot Against America, which incidentally, was a HBO miniseries that aired just this past March.
Yes, I saw it.
The idea of the story was if there was a national threat similar to what the European Jews confronted in the 1930s, what might happen to a Jewish family living in the neighborhood Roth, grew up in, which incidentally was the very same neighborhood that I grew up in as a child in Newark. In reading the book, it was as if I was revisiting the house I lived in, the neighborhood, the elementary school I went to, because it was all right there.
Sure.
Again, it was as if there was a rise of Nazis here in this country. And so, but I had to do a little bit more research, so I just plugged in a few keywords, and I came upon a couple of articles that were written recently, specifically about the German-American Bund in Newark.
Okay.
And as it turned out, what my uncle told me was validated in these stories. And the gangster, who his name was Abner Longy Zwillman, he was like the top mob guy in the New Jersey area, operated out of the Newark area. And again, he's someone, if someone does research, they'll find out all about him and his connections. And he was Jewish, and despite all of the criminal things that he did, he was a staunch defender of his people, and he felt something had to be done. So he recruited some Jewish gangsters, boxers, and I assume other people. The word got out, and somehow my father, and I would assume maybe some of his friends, became involved in this.
Wow. And did they have a name for the group that this gangster put together?
Yeah, that's really interesting because I didn't, again, my uncle didn't tell me about this, but through the research, what I found out is that they called themselves the Minutemen.
Oh, a little throwback to the Revolution.
Exactly, because that name signified their readiness during that time to fight the British at a minute's notice. And so this group wanted to emulate them and fight against the Nazis. And so that's how they referred to themselves.
And was this group repressed then over time as a result of these efforts and maybe others from the government?
I don't know specifically, but it was just a couple years later that my father joined the Army in 1941 and served there till 1945. And I think as things started to look bad for Nazi Germany, that their influence, I'm sure, waned over that time. But of course, we all know that there continue to be elements, neo-Nazi elements here in the United States. So it was never a group that really disappeared. It just morphed into different shapes and forms that we hear about now. Even recall the Charlottesville incident when there were these young guys wearing khakis and just short
they're
sleeves,
back. Yeah,
collared shirts with torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us." So they haven't disappeared completely.
No. Tell me about your uncle. Was he pretty proud of your dad?
Yes, he was. He was about 6 years younger, and they were both pretty talented athletes. And he looked up to him, and I'm sure when he was younger, idolized him, and never missed an opportunity to tell me that. He actually lived, my uncle, till 96. He died a year ago. I fortunately got to see him a few months before that. But yeah, he did look up to him. They were very close-knit, tight family.
What a great story. Thank you so much for sharing that and how you found it, because I think those are the kinds of things that inspire a lot of people to dig into some of those things they may have heard, or maybe an article they found somewhere in a box. You never know what you're going to come across.
That's right. And I really appreciate your recognizing that. And I was pleased to be able to share this with your listening audience.
He's Andrew Malikoff. He's from Long Beach, Long Island. Thanks so much for sharing the story, Andrew. And maybe we'll talk to you again sometime.
Looking forward to it.
Sometimes the things we find about our parents surprise us just a little bit when we thought we knew them so well. Well, David returns here in just a few moments as we go through your emails for more of Ask Us Anything on Extreme Genes, America's Family History Show. Genies, our friends at BYU TV have a new series out created just for us, family historians. It's called How I Got Here. It's a fast-paced travel show where young adults accompany their immigrant parents back to where they came from, their countries of origin. These are 10-day trips of a lifetime where these parent-child duos relive the sacrifice, struggle, and circumstances that led their families to leave to where they are now. There's a new episode every week with visited countries including Italy, Serbia, Mexico, Chile, Israel, Slovakia, and Ghana. BYU TV is on Roku and Fire Stick, online at byutv.org, or through the BYU TV app. How I Got Here is available now with a new episode every week. Feel the impact this journey has on those who grew up not knowing. And just a warning, keep a box of Kleenex nearby. You're going to need it. Genies, 10 years ago, in April of 2012, when the government released the 1940 census, it took Ancestry several months to complete and review an accurate index. Fast forward to today. Using proprietary handwriting reading software, it took Ancestry only 9 days to get the job done with the 1950 census. Now, they held back results for a time for actual humans to review what the software had created. And after just a few weeks, it became obvious the software was near perfect, and the computer-generated index to 153,000 names has been released. What does this mean in your journey to research your family? It means you can search the entire database quickly and easily for your family members. Never has a U.S. Census Index been created as quickly as this. Go to Ancestry.com today, click on the 1950 census on the homepage, and see what you can discover. Genies, it's Family History Month, and our friends at Legacy Tree Genealogists are celebrating by offering for a very limited time $300 off the price of a 100-hour genealogy research project. That's a lot of hours of research by some of the field's top experts. It's the perfect time to order that unique and personalized family history gift at a great price, but you must hurry. This offer ends on Saturday, November 5th. Just go to legacytree.com and use the promo code HISTORY History 300. That's one word, History 300. Legacy Tree Genealogist has been around for over 18 years and has experts covering every state and virtually every country in the world. If you've been wanting to discover your family story, take advantage of this remarkable Family History Month discount. $300 off the price of a 100-hour genealogy research project. Once again, use the promo code HISTORY300 at legacytree.com. Offer ends November 5th. All right, it is time once again for Ask Us Anything on Extreme Genes, America's Family History Show. Fisher here, David Lambert back from NEHGS over there. And David, this is from Troy in Richmond, Virginia. He says, guys, I often hear you talk about researching descendants of ancestors. Why would I want to spend time on that when I'm trying to push my ancestors' lines back? That's a reasonable question, Dave.
That really is, and I think that I always think that's what's going through people's minds when I go on Ancestry and I find DNA matches. It's like, hi, I'm your distant cousin. I have photographs of your ancestor, and they don't respond back to me. I think that people are so set on wanting to go further back, they don't look at the living generation for clues. Like that 97-year-old cousin of your grandfather that's still alive that has all the family Bibles and all the pictures. Well, you don't know because you've never thought to go collaterally. And that's the fan approach. Family, associates, and neighbors. You got to do that in genealogy
Absolutely.
to get the genealogical treasure.
I was stuck, David, for 8 years trying to figure out where my Fisher family came from in England. I couldn't get anywhere. And I was still 8 years in, pretty new to this stuff back in the late 80s. And so I decided, okay, well, I'm never going to find out where they're from. I'm just going to try to find out about all their descendants and what happened to the family and the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. And I found one guy who ran for lieutenant governor of New York, and I found somebody else who was involved with the Academy of Music in New York during the Gilded Age, and some other really interesting people. But then when I started finding living people, guess what? They had an archive in the attic. And they had handwritten letters from their great-grandmother who knew my great-great-grandfather and had written down where in England they came from and the names of the parents of both my second great-grandfather and my second great-grandmother. And then another branch had the family Bible, and another branch had all kinds of photographs, and another branch had letters and photographs. In fact, I wound up getting 9 daguerreotypes from this branch of the family from descendants. Wow. And this, to me, was a revelation. I had no idea that this could be done. In those days, this kind of thing was a very isolated occupation, right? I mean, we didn't all collaborate and talk about this with lots of other people. It just wasn't done. So I kind of felt like, hey, I just invented some brand new technique here. But the reality is it's easier to do it this way today than ever before. But you've just got to be willing to reach out and see what people have. But I always call it the archive in the attic because collectively, all those descendants out there probably have those missing puzzle pieces that you're looking for.
On the other side of the coin, you may have an old family photo that that's identified. They have the same one, but they don't know who's on the photo. So, you reaching out to them may give them clues. Obviously, it expands your holiday card list as well.
Well, and those connections are often really fun. Oftentimes you'll actually find a cousin and maybe they're not that interested, but they know the one who is. It's already within their circle, right? And so they help you connect with that person. And as a result, then you get in touch with a like-minded person, and then you start exchanging, what you've got with what they've got, and then everything kind of blows up from there. And I'm still in touch with people I met through that round of research back in the late 1980s. We're still very close. We still exchange information. And what I'm amazed at is some of these people still find things that they have in their home that they didn't know they had before. And so 35, 40 years after meeting these people, I'm still finding things from them that are just unbelievable. So It's a really important thing to trace the descendants of your ancestors, especially if you're trying to figure out who their parents were and where they were from, especially if you're trying to push those lines back. This is the Archive in the Attic, so go find it. And Troy, thanks for the question. It's a reasonable one, and I hope that helps you out. And coming up next, we've got another question from Coos Bay, Oregon, when we return in 3 minutes on Extreme Genes, America's Family History Show. All right, here we go. Another question for Ask Us Anything on Extreme Genes, America's Family History Show. I am Fisher, your congenial host, with David Allen Lambert, the chief genealogist of the New England Historic Genealogical Society at AmericanAncestors.org. David, Pamela asked this question from Coos Bay, Oregon. She says, Fish and Dave, one of my people in the 18th century was institutionalized for insanity. How do I find those records, and are they likely to have survived? Good question.
Well, generally speaking, I'll go back to my days working at the Massachusetts State Archives. They do survive, but because of HIPAA, which stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA will often prevent us access to these records. Now, every state is a little different on the flexibility of their State Department of Health. There are some institutional records that have been digitized. Some have even been indexed. Also, it really depends on the time frame. So, for instance, genealogists complained to the Department of Public Health and Human Services back a decade or so ago in regard to why can't these records be released. And in most cases, if the person has died beyond 50 years ago, the records are a little bit more flexible. Now, that doesn't mean that the general public can go down and start looking at everyone who was institutionalized. But if it's your direct family member, this is where you can maybe get your grandfather's case, or your grandmother's, or even your parent, for instance. They're valuable records for a variety of reasons because, of course, mental health may be some concern in your genealogy that you're trying to track down where did it stem from. Or, just knowing where someone is born that may have been recorded in a record in 1896 for your German ancestor. Or the maiden name of a great-great-grandmother that was institutionalized that may talk about her arriving from Ireland years ago on a vessel and that she had contracted something that ended up being in an institution. Because my grandfather was institutionalized, Fish. He was institutionalized for tuberculosis.
Yes.
Now, my grandfather would be 135 years old, and I know that James Albert George is familiar to the thoughts and minds of all of our listeners, but I still can't look at his record, and it's from 1940. He would not be alive. So it really is going to depend on the state, Pam, as to what their rules are. So I would contact first the state archives. That's generally where state institutions go to. Now, if it's a private asylum, that's where the problem might be, Fish. They may just not exist if the records were, not turned over to a historical organization. I mean, the state may have not mandated it because it wasn't under state control.
Sure.
The other thing is knowing another way around the story. I mean, if you have somebody who died in an asylum and you want to know what they died from, just get their death record. That won't be padded. It will say what's on it. How about you? How about in your research? Have you had any luck getting these type of records?
Yes, actually, I have a third great-grandfather who was institutionalized as insane back in the 1830s. And so there are a lot of records from the New York Almshouse online and Bellevue Hospital that go back to the 19th century. And then there was the mother of my grandfather's first wife, and she was institutionalized, died in the 1920s in California. And I was able to find, for instance, in the census records that she was on the list. She was accounted for as being in this institution. So really, there are some things you can find, obviously some a little deeper than others in terms of, what has ailed these folks and why they're there. But you really just have to keep looking. And it's nice to know some of these records are online. You can find them on Ancestry and on other sites as well. So great question. Thanks so much for it, Pamela. And Dave, thanks so much for your help again. We'll talk to you next week.
I look forward to it, my friend.
All right. And that's our show for this week. And thanks once again to our guests, Scott Norick of Chicago and Andrew Malikoff from Long Island, talking about their extraordinary finds as ordinary people. If you missed any of the show, of course, catch the podcast version. It's available on TuneIn Radio, Apple Media, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and ExtremeGenes.com. Talk to you again next week. And remember, as far as everyone knows, we're a nice, normal family.